Welcome to our channel, a place where emotions are pushed to their limits and every story unfolds with intensity, conflict, and raw human truth. Here, we dive deep into dramatic narratives filled with betrayal, inner turmoil, and the difficult choices that define who we are. Our content goes beyond simple storytelling. It explores the psychological battles, the breaking points, and the moments when characters are forced to confront the darkest sides of themselves. If you're drawn to gripping drama, unpredictable twists, and stories that keep you thinking long after they end, you're in the right place. Every video we create is crafted to pull you into a world where nothing is simple, where every decision has consequences, and where no one walks away unchanged. The decision did not arrive as a single clean break. It came in fragments, sharp, jagged pieces of realization that Abby could no longer ignore. At first, she told herself that Devon's anger was temporary, a phase born from pressure, from unresolved wounds, from fears he could not articulate. She excused the tension in his voice, the way his patience evaporated without warning, the unsettling silence that followed his outbursts. But over time, those fragments formed something undeniable, something heavier than denial could contain. The house had changed long before Abby admitted it. What was once filled with cautious hope had become saturated with an invisible weight. Every room carried the echo of Devon's frustration. Every corner seemed to tighten around Abby's chest. She began to anticipate his moods before he even spoke, reading the smallest shifts in his expression like warnings of an approaching storm. It was not just anger, it was anger that lingered, that seeped into everything, that refused to dissolve even when the moment had passed. Devon himself was unraveling in ways he refused to confront. Beneath his rage was a deeper, more corrosive emotion. Resentment. It was not always directed at Abby, but she became its closest target. He felt displaced, as though something that should have belonged to him had been quietly taken away. The presence of Dominic, instead of grounding him, amplified that sense of loss. He saw in the child a reminder of expectations he could not meet, of a role he was uncertain how to inhabit. Instead of acknowledging that fear, he masked it with control, with intensity, with a need to assert himself in ways that only pushed Abby further away. Abby noticed the shift first in the smallest interactions, the way Devon's gaze lingered too long, searching for something to criticize. The way he reacted to harmless situations with disproportionate force. The way his silence became colder, heavier, more deliberate. She began to feel as though she was constantly navigating a minefield, calculating every word, every action, trying to prevent the next eruption. But the eruptions came anyway, unpredictable and increasingly difficult to contain. Dominic became the silent witness to it all, too young to understand, yet sensitive enough to feel the tension that filled the air. Abby saw it in the way he clung to her more tightly, in the way his eyes searched her face for reassurance whenever Devon's presence shifted the atmosphere. That was when fear began to replace doubt. This was no longer just about her ability to endure. It was about what staying would mean for her child. Still, leaving was not simple. Abby was not someone who abandoned things easily. She had built her life on perseverance, on the belief that conflicts could be resolved if both sides were willing to fight for something better. But what she faced now was not a conflict that could be reasoned with. It was a cycle, one that fed on itself, growing stronger each time it went unchallenged. Devon, meanwhile, felt the distance even before Abby acknowledged it aloud. He interpreted her growing caution as rejection, her silence as judgment. Instead of questioning his own behavior, he doubled down on his defensiveness. He convinced himself that he was the one being wronged, that Abby was slowly pulling away without giving him a chance to fix things. That belief hardened into something dangerous, a justification for his anger, a narrative that allowed him to avoid accountability. The more Abby withdrew, the more Devon escalated. It was not always explosive. Sometimes it was subtle, a calculated withdrawal of warmth, a deliberate indifference that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Other times, it was sudden and overwhelming, a surge of emotion that left no room for logic. Abby found herself caught between these extremes, unable to predict which version of Devon she would face from one moment to the next. The turning point did not come with a single dramatic event, but rather with a quiet, devastating clarity. Abby realized that she had started to change in response to Devon's behavior. She was no longer acting out of confidence or instinct, but out of fear of triggering another reaction, fear of destabilizing an already fragile environment. She had begun to shrink herself, to make compromises she would have once refused without hesitation. And in doing so, she was losing something essential. That realization was both painful and liberating. It stripped away the last layer of denial, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. Staying was not an act of strength. It was an act of surrender to a situation that would only continue to deteriorate. Devon sensed the shift before Abby spoke it into reality. There was something different in the way she moved, in the way she looked at him, not with fear this time, but with a quiet resolve that unsettled him more than any argument could have. It triggered something primal in him, a desperate need to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. But control, once lost, cannot be reclaimed through force. Devon's attempts only reinforced Abby's decision. Each reaction, each escalation became further proof that the environment she was leaving behind was no longer salvageable. The moment she began to pack was surreal. It felt both inevitable and impossible. Every item she touched carried a memory, a reminder of how things used to be or how she had once hoped they could become. There was grief in that process, a quiet mourning for something that had never fully existed outside of her expectations. Devon watched it unfold with a mixture of disbelief and fury. To him, this was not a consequence of his actions, but a betrayal. He interpreted Abby's departure as abandonment, as a confirmation of his deepest fears that he was not enough, that he had been replaced, that he had lost something he could never regain. Instead of confronting those feelings, he allowed them to manifest as anger, sharper and more volatile than ever before. That anger, however, no longer had the power it once did. Abby had crossed a threshold. The fear that once kept her anchored had been replaced by something stronger: determination. She was no longer reacting to Devon's emotions. She was acting on her own. Taking Dominic and leaving was not just a physical departure. It was a psychological break, a rejection of the environment that had slowly consumed her sense of safety. It was also a risk stepping into uncertainty, into a future that was not clearly defined. But for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty felt less threatening than the life she was leaving behind. Devon was left in the aftermath, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been his reality. Without Abby and Dominic, the house felt different, not quieter, but emptier in a way that forced him to confront himself. The anger that had once filled the space now had nowhere to go. It turned inward, exposing the cracks he had worked so hard to ignore. But self-awareness does not come easily, especially when it requires acknowledging one's own role in destruction. Devon hovered on the edge of that realization, torn between blaming Abby and confronting the truth. That internal conflict became its own form of torment, a battle between pride and the possibility of change. Abby, on the other hand, faced her own struggles. Freedom did not erase the emotional weight of what she had endured. There were moments of doubt, moments where she questioned whether she had done the right thing. The absence of conflict did not immediately translate into peace. It took time for her to unlearn the patterns she had developed, to rebuild a sense of stability for both herself and Dominic. Yet even in those moments of uncertainty, there was a clarity she had not felt in a long time. She was no longer trapped in a cycle of reaction. She was moving forward, however slowly, on her own terms. The distance between them became more than physical. It was a divide shaped by choices, by consequences, by the refusal or inability to confront deeper truths. Whether that divide would ever be bridged remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The version of their lives that had existed before was gone, replaced by something far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more real.